Welcome to another Getting Smart Town Hall. I am Mason Pasha with Getting Smart, and today we are talking about futures thinking in education. You may have heard the term futures thinking before, and maybe that's what brought you here. You may be really passionate about education and love shaking things up. Regardless, we're super happy to have you here and have some incredible guests along with us. Over the last probably decade plus, we've highlighted a ton of topics, which we would call campaigns or theories most often. These are 5 of those from the last 7 years. Math's hard. So we did one about AI. We've done one on difference making, which is all about instilling purpose in learning. We're doing one currently on new pathways, which is really about connecting students to success for what's next for them, which involves thinking a ton about the future, right? What is the future of connecting students to meaningful work? What is the purpose, or how do you connect students to credentialing experiences in the future? We did one on smart cities, which is all about like how cities can facilitate learning. And we've done one on green pathways about sustainability. Tom Vander Ark, do you want to just share a little bit about your relationship to the term futures thinking? I think you've spearheaded a lot of these. I'm curious about how that term lands for you.
I love this topic and I appreciate all of you joining this summer morning. It's been important to me for, 50 years. There's a really long, surprisingly long history of the future. The folks at Rand started studying it in the 1950s, where I think the idea of scenario planning was really popularized by Royal Dutch Shell in the 60s. And it's surprisingly prepared them really well for the oil shock of the 70s. And so when I started doing advanced degree work in energy finance, scenario planning and futures was a really important part of my graduate course of study. And to the extent that I quit the energy business and started a futures planning organization called the Center for Strategic Planning. Around then, this is about 1984, Santa Fe Institute launched and really pioneered complex adaptive systems thinking. They really introduced us to complexity and to systems thinking. That led the way to Peter Senge. His book, Fifth Discipline, was probably the most professionally important book to me of the last 50 years. It really outlined mental models of how we each create mental models of our present and our future, of team learning and systems thinking. And I think Senge and Santa Fe introduced the idea of systems thinking as a new foundation for futures, for modern futures work. I think this topic is super important right now because we're 40 years into an era of exponential change. The information age was exponential change, and we have linear brains, and we have a hard time conceptualizing exponential change. So one of the key future skills is exponential thinking and building that into scenario analysis. We're about 30 years into complex systems and in a real recognition of climate change. So man-made and natural systems becoming very complex and interacting in ways that are super hard to predict. And now we're about 2 years into this new generative AI age, kicking off a new S-curve of exponential change and requiring us all to update our mental models. So just a couple shout outs for things that I think are really important right now. We had a couple of people reference some sci-fi, but thanks to all the teachers on the call, that English and social studies teachers that have incorporated sci-fi. I think that has been and will be a really important way for us as a species to interrogate the future. Modeling complex systems is super important. We had a great podcast that came out this week with Conrad Wolfram, where he argues we ought to stop teaching hand calculations like factoring polynomials and long division and start teaching modeling complex systems. And I super appreciate that. And then entrepreneurial thinking really requires systems thinking, and it comes to the future through the lens of opportunity spotting. How and where can I help create value for my community? So I think those are all currently important parts of future training, and part of why the future ought to be a set of skills that we're teaching kids that ought to be infused across the curriculum. And I'm looking forward to a dialogue about how and where we can do that. Last shout is just thanks to our friends at Knowledge Works who for 20 years have had a future practice. We appreciate their long-term commitment to studying the future and sharing scenarios of the future with all of us. And then the D School we'll hear from today. The Stanford D School has been another super important organization that helped us learn about design thinking and futures thinking. So we're excited to bring this topic to life with a great panel. Thanks, Mason.
Of course. Thanks, Tom. Great context. I think one of the early provocations just getting started, I think I was in college when it was like, it's interesting that we have history classes, but we don't have future classes, right? Like something like school where you're trying to prepare young people for their future, for the future. We really don't ever talk about it in a way that takes it seriously or invites them in with confidence. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We can ignore this slide, but as I said on the website, we're always talking about series. All of them have to do with the future in some way or another, even if we're not calling them future. So last year, I had the extreme privilege of participating in a couple of great futures experiences, one of them with each of our speakers today. So I invited them on to help share a little bit of the things that they shared with me, with all of you. So we've got Sara Skvirsky with the Institute for the Future. I participated in their Foresight Essentials program last year, which was super awesome. Equipped me with a ton of tools for scenario planning, thinking about the future. And you're going to get to see a little glimpse into some of that today. We focused on climate migration was our topic. So it was all about how climate migration might and will shape the future. And then we also have Ariel Raz from the D School at Stanford, which Tom shouted out. I was able to go to a little summit with them down in California, and that was a super cool way to test some of their new tools and their things that they have publicly available to all of you. So we're going to talk about that a little bit as well. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to the guests. Please drop questions in the chat. We are recording. We will be publishing a transcript. And Ariel, take it away.
You might have noticed that I work at the D School. D stands for design. I don't work at the S School for future. So I wouldn't say that I am a expert futurist who's deep in this. I play one on TV. I play one on webinars, but I have created a decent body of practice trying to translate futurism into education. That's really my perspective. Having been a middle school special education teacher, having worked at the D School, which is really exceptional, what attracted me to the place at bringing complex ideas into practice, ideas like design, ideas like creativity. We also turned our attention to futures over the last few years. The way that this kind of started is I have read this quote or a variation of this quote, and I've heard it 100 times at different professional development experiences as a participant, as an educator, as a facilitator, as a speaker. And it goes something like, educators must prepare students to thrive in a world that doesn't exist yet. And this is thrown out to the audience of educators as this is like another thing that they should put on their plate as they're planning, as they're preparing, as they're doing behavioral management, as they're arranging the space of their classrooms and creating curriculum. And then it's like easy, right? Be a superhero. And also, by the way, like teach to the future. It's not easy. It's not, in fact, it's quite hard. But the thing that I've learned is it's not impossible. There is like a pretty robust body of knowledge around teaching these skills. These are teachable and learnable practices. And then the question becomes like, how do we practice it? How do we teach it? How do we help young people learn it? What is the body of knowledge that we need to build as educators? And what is a body of knowledge that we need to impart to students? So I'm going to tell a story of how we got together. So years ago at the D School, we started asking questions like this. This would have been 2018, 2019, pre-coronavirus, right, when the world, and we asked questions like, what do you think is inevitable? How do we cultivate empathy for the future? The D School, design thinking with empathy. How do we extend empathy across time and connect with individuals who don't exist yet, who live in new systems? And then who shapes our future? Who has agency when we look towards the future and towards creating, manifesting, and building towards their preferred futures? And I have to shout out my amazing colleague, Lisa K. Solomon, who is deep in strategic planning, has done a lot of work in futurism with the Global Business Network and with Singularity University. And she really brought this forward, this type of thinking with us. So she had a framework which she called See, Shade, Share. Sarah will introduce other frameworks which are deeper and more complex. This is, I think, a really nice starting point for us, right? How do we see the future? How do we see different futures? How do we shape our preferred future, make sure that it's something that is articulated and we well understand? And then how do we share it with our community so that we're moving towards this future together in a way that is coherent, understandable? If you're more visually inclined, you can think of seeing the future as there are a lot of different signals that exist in the marketplace, in the universe, in our life. How do we start to see them as being influential to what might come to be? And then what are the different paths that those signals might take shape into? And then how do we create a picture? How do we create a verbal portrait or an actual image that is legible to the people that we work with, the people that we are in community with, so that they can then understand that as well? And then there was this thing that happened called coronavirus. And as that was taking place, Lisa, because we had the good fortune of having Lisa on our team, she ran us through what Tom described earlier, a strategic planning process. What we did in this period of uncertainty is we tried to identify what was critical to what was happening globally or nationally, and how might that affect us? So thinking at a high level, one driving force during coronavirus was the time and strength of the virus spread. So thought of this as existing on a spectrum of short to mild or long and intense. This would be your y-axis on your 2x2. And then the other driving force is economic impact, which is connected to the virus, but can also be independent of it, right? Because how the economy responds, how individual actors respond could create a period of short recovery of growth or kind of a deep lasting economic effect. So what we do in the planning process, we take those two elements, those driving forces together, we create a 2x2, and now what you have are 4 scenarios. And you give them names. Now, this is thought said the future is always dystopian, usually in what's called quadrant 3, right? Collapse. If you're talking about dystopian, that might take place in that third quadrant, a collapse scenario where things are going bad. But there are other scenarios as well. And creating something like this with driving forces can give you a sense of what are the narratives that are taking place. So this is done with coronavirus, but you can do it with other drivers, other trends that you see in the current marketplace. It's something that's very helpful to do with community of educators if you are uncertain about the future and you're hoping to understand how the future might take shape, the kind of narrative of those futures. Not to be precise per se about what will happen, but to be very clear in the narrative so you can isolate what might happen and then better understand it. As I said before, it's very helpful to think in images. You might take these titles and add images to it, right? So in a collapse scenario, we're seeing long lines. In a transformation scenario, we're seeing drone delivery of medication and so on and so forth. Really, I think you can start to feel like I understand this more effectively once I put some visuals on it. And then we can get descriptive and language, right? I won't go into all of these because they're very precise and technical, but this is starting to world build and say each of these scenarios, what does it actually look like? How would we describe it? What are the indicators that will tell us we are actually in a transformation moment or we are in a collapse moment? Because now we can start to prepare ourselves and adapt as individuals, as an organization for this future that is coming into shape. Okay, I'm on minute 8. I'm just going to share one last series and then I'll pick it over. I'll skip over this. So what we did much after the pandemic. So the best time to practice futurism is in a crisis, and like the worst time to practice futurism is in a crisis. It's good because it's urgent. You need it. You can apply it. But it's bad because you don't always learn the lessons and create the meaningful change at your organization, right? You're responding to the crisis instead of creating some deep-rooted strategies and practices. So after the pandemic softened, we took what we taught in the course that was of this methodology, and we created what we call Climate Approaches for Futures Thinking. I'll share a website for this at the very end. And we describe it as seeing in multiple. So how do you see different futures, like those 4 narratives that I mentioned? How do you trace change across time? This one is really pregnant with meaning. It can be around system change. It can be around understanding exponential time versus linear time. This could be mathematical. It can also be experiential. So tracing change across time is another approach. World building, right? How do we see the future in texture, in detail, so we really understand it fully? How do we see it in visual detail as well? How do we have empathy for the future, right? How do we connect emotionally with the people who are not yet here, but might be hard for us to imagine, but we know might be our descendants, might be our relatives, people that we should care about, even though they don't exist in the same time frame as us? And then finally, how do we seek visions of coexistence? How do we create futures where different types of people, different identities, different needs are taken into account so that the future is one that is not just designed and articulated for a particular person, but for multiple people with multiple beliefs and identities? This is the last slide. These are the 5 approaches to futures thinking. We have a lot of strategies and curriculum that we've developed for this, and I'll get to that in a little bit because my time is up. And it's their turn to come up and speak about future.
Yeah, thank you so much. And hello, everyone. I'm really thrilled to be joining you here today. And I'm going to start my time with a slide that we use at the beginning of, I run a lot of foresight education program. We always start with reminding people that nobody can predict. The future hasn't happened yet, which is an amazing opening and sort of freeing opportunity for us to think about strategically and systematically and creatively about all of the possibilities that are happening around us today. It's not just one, as we just heard from Ariel. We just heard it, we're going from many different possibilities to think about what is the world that we want to create? What is the world that we'd like to live in? How do we turn all of this chaos around us into inspiration and possibility for action? It's actually going off of your pandemic, COVID-19 little conversation. I like to think about thinking about the future a bit like a vaccine. You pre-experience a little bit of the future right now by going through all of this array of different possibilities in order to, when it actually happens, you're more prepared. You've already thought about it a little bit. You're not starting from scratch. You're able to really react a lot faster and have more of that muscle memory to go into. Now, I know a lot of people know about the D School, who's Institute for the Future. To the best of our knowledge, we're the longest running institute thinking about the future in the world. We've been around since 1968. And really our goal, we're based in Silicon Valley, but we have people really all around the world, including in Brazil, where we have our friends joining us here today. But really what our mission is to help organizations and to help leaders, to help communities become future ready. And that is through a number of things. We do that through bringing people some of the tools to think about the future, like Mason, who went through the course with me last year. We think about research. We have recent research that came out on the future of children, looking at the futures of democracy, the futures of AI, and how that's impacting the workplace. And we have lots of different programming that we put together to help people engage with the future in a really productive way. Now, let's just talk a little bit when I say future thinking, strategic foresight, what do they all mean? And I use them interchangeably. Strategic foresight is just a set of tools, processes, and mindsets to help inform decision-making under conditions of uncertainty. And the way that we approach this and improve our approach to foresight as individuals, as organizations, is by using this framework. And again, you can use any number of frameworks, but this is something that we've been working on developing over the course of the last 57 years, is that in order to think about the future, I think oftentimes people just jump in and say, this is what the future could be, which is great. But you really need to start by preparing. You need to think about what are the questions you even want to be asking? What's some evidence on the ground that we're seeing today about how the world might look different? You want to use all of this to then develop these multiple, as we were looking at with the scenarios, right? Plausible, provocative visions of more than one future. So you're not just going into one possibility. And then you use that to start to understand and generate implications and meaningful implications for you, for your school, for your community, for your faculty, for your staff, for all of this work that you're doing. You bring it down, you say, what do these big outside-in pictures mean for me? And there's no point in thinking about the future unless you plan on actually doing something about it and actually taking it through to action. And so that's what we help people do. We help them think big, bring it through to implications, and then think about what are the actions that we can take today. Now, I want to share a little bit about a project that I'm working on right now. I'm actually in Santa Ana of SAUSD fame. So I'm in Santa Ana right now, and I'm going to be working with this group just in a couple of hours. But Santa Ana Unified School District, working with their phenomenal superintendent, who's going to be speaking with Getting Smart in just a week or two, or the next gathering that you have, Jerry. And I've been working recently really closely with Bianca Bierkeen, who is the Assistant Superintendent of Teaching and Learning for K-12. And she's a phenomenal person. And what I've been doing with them is thinking about how can we integrate foresight more deeply into the work that they're doing as a district. Now, specifically, what Bianca has done is she's brought together a group of 50 people, which is who we're working with. We're calling them the Innovation Catalyst Collective. And this is a group of people who are all across. We have staff members from all levels. We have people who are classroom educators. We have folks who are classified. We have all across the range of people who applied who said, I want to think about the future. I want to think about how do we transform our system for the world of 10 plus years from now. Ultimately, this program is going to be coming up with a series of pilots in areas such as learning experience design, policy, infrastructure, stakeholder education, assessment, equity, and inclusivity. So all of these things are going to be ultimately transformed into pilots. But what we're doing right now is we're looking at what are the big drivers of change, the big megatrends, the major forces that are going to impact the next 10 plus years of the district, and specifically thinking of teaching and learning. And so that can be anything from the rising political polarization of everything to cost of living increases, widening income gap, and increasing unaffordability of Santa Ana, climate chaos, and also the increasing awareness that we need to focus on that space. So we're taking these things, and then we're going to be looking up signals of change, really anomalies of ways people are doing things radically differently on the ground, and thinking about how can we think about the types of actions that we want to take today. So that's just one example of the ways that you can, as a school district, start thinking about what are the big forces that are going to impact us? How can we start to interpret this along with sort of anomalies and exciting innovations that we're seeing on the ground? So one example of one of the many ways that we work with foresight. Mason, I wanted to see if you wanted to ask any questions before we jump into activity time.
Yeah, we've got some great stuff in the chat. Thank you all so much for being engaging as always. One thing, Sarah, if you wouldn't mind just giving a little voiceover to this idea of a signal a little more strongly. I think a lot of people are having not a struggle, but there's an obvious tension between this, like the future is here and the future is coming, right? Like it's everywhere. And there's that William Gibson quote that I dropped in that it is here, but it's not evenly distributed. The framing of signals, which IFTF uses, was really helpful to me. So maybe just give a couple sentences and an example of what a signal might be.
Absolutely. So signals of change, that quote perfectly describes it. The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. None of these big innovations or ahas that come about in our society are coming out of nowhere. All of this AI work, it's been tested in the lab for years. It's been tried and failed. We've had folks that are doing things that are really cutting edge, but maybe it's just not the right time. We're seeing new social behaviors about how folks are going things about differently before we see the major movements that are shifting and changing our world. So signals of change are these sort of standout examples of things that we're seeing happening out there that make us stop and say, that's different. That's just not how I expect the world to function. For example, there's a school district in Alaska that has rearranged their school calendar to be aligned with the traditional harvest seasons. I'm like, wow, that's just not how everybody's doing it already. I'm not saying this is the norm, but it just makes me stop and say, wow, that's interesting. And that could point to a world where we do things in a different way. So we're constantly on the lookout for these examples, these signals, these sort of blips on the radar of what's happening that makes us think, wow, this could point to a radically different future. We're not picking and placing bets and saying this is the next big company. We're just saying there's something here. There's a reason why people are doing things. Let's examine it a little bit further and take that time to question ourselves about what's changing in the world. Oftentimes, these are a reaction to the big shifts that we're seeing. So I wanted to bring in an activity that was put together by my wonderful colleague, Jane McGonigal, who's written several books. And I highly recommend her most recent book, Imaginable, which really takes you into a bunch of different immersive alternative future worlds and has you think about how you might interact with that, the types of skill sets that you bring to the future. But one of the activities that she's put together is this idea of flipping the future. And it's a tool that's also in our IFTF Foresight Essentials toolkit, which is that we teach in our classes. So hoping that you get some fun out of this experience. Okay, first up, this is the activity. You pick a topic, you list things that are generally true about them today, you flip those ideas on their heads, and then you imagine a world in which those flipped facts, those flipped truths are now a reality and why that might be the case. So that's really the way that it goes. So let me give you some example on something that we all know and love, shoes. So let's talk about shoes. Some things that are generally true about shoes today. Number one, shoes cost money, right? And people take their shoes off when they go to sleep. We can all generally agree on these things, right? Maybe some people keep them on when they go to sleep. Maybe some people get some nice brand deals or something, get those shoes for free. But generally, these things are true. Now let's flip these ideas on their head. So we're going to flip it from shoes cost money to now shoes are free. People take their shoes off when they go to sleep. Many people sleep with their shoes on. Now these two things on the surface seem pretty ridiculous, right? They're like, no, that's not how the world works. But what we want to do with this activity is to work with and we talk about like cognitive flexibility, to think about a world in which these things could actually not be so ridiculous. They're just seemingly ridiculous at first. So we're just going in and we're going to say, how could we get to the world in a pretty logical way? So let's start with shoes are free. Let's look at this. So data, personal data, companies love it. So we could not so distantly in the future imagine a world in which we are walking around in shoes that maybe we've been provided by the company in exchange for our data. So free means no money, right? You don't pay money, but maybe you're paying in your data instead. We've already seen in Singapore, for example, Fitbit was giving out free Fitbits in exchange for people's information. There's a lot of stuff that you get from people's shoes and directions and where people are. So I can absolutely imagine a future in which shoes are actually free and we get them all in exchange for the data that we're starting to see transmitted through the shoes that we're walking around in. Now, in a slightly darker sense, people sleeping with their shoes on. This is an image from a wildfire in California where I live. And people sleeping with their shoes on. So people say, the American Red Cross says that one of the biggest barriers to people getting out of their houses in a rush, in an emergency, in a fire, is finding their shoes. So they recommend that people sleep with their shoes by the bed, etc. But you can imagine, especially if something's in your area, that we could live in a future. And I know that both of us coming from California, Ariel, thinking about sleeping with our shoes on potentially in those times where it's peak fire season and we know we might need to go at a moment's notice. So these two facts that seem so, and these flip facts, which seem so ridiculous, are actually not that wild when you start to think about that. So we want to think about that with K-12 education. Now, shoes by the bed, Tornado Alley tip as well. So I want to share with you 10 truths about K-12 education today. Learning tends to happen in classrooms. Arts are not included in standardized tests. Teachers are adults. Students are children. Students are often pushed to pursue higher education. We're facing a national teacher shortage, different approaches to education based on your age. There tend to be lower aggregate outcomes for male youth of color. Seat time is a key metric. A small portion of students have IEPs. Curriculum doesn't necessarily reflect the cultures of the students. Okay, so these are just 10 things that generally tend to be true about K-12 education today. And I want to practice flipping one with you because flipping isn't just going from arts are not included in standardized tests to arts are included in standardized tests. That would be something like you can have alternatives as well. So having an art portfolio is a graduation requirement. or art is considered as equally valuable as math, or maybe creativity is a key component on standardized tests. So I want you to think about that process as we go through. And I'm going to give you 2 minutes on your own to select one fact from the list. And I will put that list back up. You don't need to have memorized it. And flip it. Just try an alternative. And then once you flipped it, I'd love for you to type it into chat, add the fact number in front of it. So 2. I actually did that wrong. Having our portfolio is a graduation requirement. And then how do you think we realistically got there? So you could spend some time putting that into chat. Otherwise, I might ask one of you to come off mute and share a little bit about, and we can maybe think together as a group how we think we got to that place. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to select something from the list, put the number in front of it, and then put out there your flipped.
Ariel, we're about to get into your activity. Before we do, question for both Sarah and Ariel. Saw a question in the chat about SAUSD, Sarah, and what the factors were that really primed them to take this on. What would you say leadership readiness needs to look like in order to adopt some of these principles in a more meaningful way and integrate them throughout a system or into classrooms? And this can be for both of you, but you want to start, Sarah, since you're with SAUSD.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that a lot of futures you'll find is for like getting the right leadership in place. Also, if you're not a district leader, being able to get all of the people excited and ready to then, when you have the right leadership in place, to just run with it, or when the right moment happens, that you're able to go with it. I think that in this case, Jerry had been thinking about the future for quite some time. And I'm sure, you all can have this conversation when you have that next Getting Smart webinar and town hall. And in his case, I think, and in the district's case, AI has been a really big sort of catalyst for saying we need to get on these things now, realizing that stuff is happening faster than they really even thought before, and that they have an imperative to prepare themselves and their students for that future. And so I think for a lot of districts, I've seen this as a bit of a shock in a way that I think, COVID was for some other organizations, to say that between that and the chronic absenteeism that we're seeing, there's this combination of factors that if they don't lead the way, who will? And so that's really what I've seen with a lot of the orgs that I've worked with. It's folks that are maybe even in a really great place right now, but say we want to remain in that great place and we want to take that next step towards the future. But Ariel, I don't know if you had anything else there.
I think it functions so differently at a leadership layer than at an instructional layer. And for the most part, I trust classroom teachers to figure out how to integrate some of these practices. Like similarly for design thinking, I get asked by kindergarten teachers, how do I teach them to be designers? And sometimes I'm hired to do that. And I feel maybe pulled in too many directions, because at those younger ages, skills are so foundational that it's not really design thinking or futures thinking. It's like you're teaching them to notice, you're teaching them to pay attention, teaching them to care about one another. And then as the ages and the development becomes more advanced, I think you have a little bit more kind of opportunity to be technical. So measuring change, projecting change, thinking about what will be. I do think a common element, and you spoke more about the leadership, something about instruction, is really just harnessing imagination and allowing kids to think beyond. It's something they're naturally really inclined to, but you can attach like more complexity to it, more development to it, more detail to it. And that's where I think you get the more interesting kind of aspects of futures thinking, right? And thinking about a person, what clothes are they wearing? What does a city look like that they live in? Describe it. Tell me what it feels like. What does it look like? What does it sound like? So really starting with imagination and then searching for a lot of that world building detail.
Love that. Thank you. And thank you, Allison, for Teach the Future in the tab too. That is a great resource.
Yeah, Teach the Future is good. This is a segue toward what I'm going to do.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm going to, again, just being mindful of the clock. We'll see how far we get. I'm starting off by some work that was inspired by conversations with my colleague Walker, who's also on this call, which comes from research from business school and leadership, and I think has a lot of implication for how we talk about the future at organizations. This kind of exists more at the organizational layer. So it came from this tweet that Kwaku shared with me, an idea called the blurry vision bias. And I think a really good way to think about this is that we tend to communicate our purpose or the purpose of an organization to one another in language. But the thing that motivates people is not abstract language. It's really specific image-laden rhetoric. So we communicate words, but what translates well and transfers well is images. Yeah, so this Ethan Mollick is really an AI researcher, but here he's talking about something a little bit different. Let me demonstrate. So if you want to try to motivate some behavior change, stop drinking sugary soda, or let's get fewer people to drink sugary soda, you might teach them to read the back of the label. Oh my God, 39 grams of sugar. That's terrible. You don't want to drink all that sugar. But what's been proven to be more effective is this image, which actually shows you the amount of sugar that's in a glass of Coke, right? So you can actually visualize it. You can see the object. And again, that motivates behavior change more effectively. So what is common is abstract language, but what works is image-based rhetoric. So it doesn't have to be an image of itself. It can be image-laden language or a kind of a verbal portrait. For example, to stop smoking, similar to that Coca-Cola example, they did a study where they showed people, or they described to people, an outsider will reel back in disgust from the smoker's putrid odor. So that it's an image that's being described in word, right? Reeling back in disgust. You might take something like the future of space travel as a vision statement or a purpose statement. That's very abstract. That's very general. What would be more effective is like we're going to build the first school on Mars, right? We can see a school. We can see the kids in there. We know there might be parents on Mars. They're going to be learning stuff. There needs to be a building, right? It becomes much more understandable. And then instead of focusing on the meaning-based system, like really channeling the experience-based system. This comes from all of that study on the blurry vision bias. And the powerful thing here is that when there is this image, when hundreds or thousands of individuals possess it, it really benefits social cognition. So not only does it motivate the individuals, it has the secondary benefit of creating a common purpose that people can act towards in unison, or at least in lockstep, so they can realize this collective achievement. So this is the advantage of using language, which has a common, visceral, realistic. Let me just skip over. I'll skip over some of these slides. I'll just show you. This is a really powerful project from our colleagues at Resistance Communications, Meredith and Aisha. And what they did is they asked young girls in refugee zones, things like Palestinian refugees in Syria, in the Congo. They asked them, what do you want to be when you grow up? And which is, right, we all ask kids of that. But then they did this amazing thing where they photographed them in the outfit, in the uniform of their future careers. And what I love is they interviewed them and they had them construct a narrative as if their future goal had been achieved. A while ago, I wanted to be able to help her and other women like her, right? So this is thinking about the past from the position of the future. In this image, I look back on my journey here. Remember that I once doubted and feared that I would never achieve my goals, but I grew to understand I can be who I want to be. This is really just the power of having a strong image of the future that you can describe and communicate with and then drive for. I want you to step into a time machine, take a picture with your mind of the place where you work. That could be a school, it could be Getting Smart, a university, whatever organization you work in. And I want you to describe what to the other members of your breakout room. This is not I see belonging, right? Because you can't see belonging. It's I see kids of different ages working together in the same classroom, right? You want to actually describe the objects, the actions that you see as if there's something that you can be experienced by yourself. Working. I just want to end with this quote from Fred Pollack. I'm sure Sarah is really familiar with the basic idea here. Fred was writing post-World War II, and he was studying the images that were in the culture in Nazi Germany and other European nations at that time. And he came up with this idea and this concept of image of the future, right? This kind of strong, powerful, purposeful visual that we are striving towards, and it can really track the progress or the devolution of a society. And so as lingering questions that we will not answer, but I want to leave you with here is, what images do you see for the future of your school, for the future of your organization? Are they positive? Are they negative? Are they sustainable? What does that actually look like? And you might ask yourself, or what do you expect to change? What do you expect to stay the same as you move forward in the next 5-10 years? If you liked this activity, it's available. A version of it is available. I'll put the link in the chat as well. ktalkfutures.stanford.edu is the thanks, Nathan. Is the page where we house all of these resources. And then lastly, if you do want to talk further, you want to get in touch, you want to just have a conversation, learn more about this work, I'm very happy to engage further in this work. It's a really big passion of mine, and it's been a pleasure to be.
Awesome. Ariel, Sara, thank you so much for being here. Thank you, everybody else. And yeah, just have a great rest of your week.